Imagine for a moment. You're sitting in front of your computer at 3 p.m. on a Wednesday. There's a project open on your screen for 2 hours. Not 2 hours of productive work. 2 hours of cursor blinking while your mind invents 1,000 creative excuses. Maybe you need more research. Maybe you should reorganize your files first. Maybe today isn't the right day to start. And as minutes drag on, that familiar feeling grows in your chest. It isn't laziness. It's something deeper. It's as if an invisible part of you is holding your arms, preventing you from typing the first word. And you don't understand why. You want to do this. You need to do this. But the more you try to force, the stronger the resistance becomes, until you close the laptop defeated, promising tomorrow will be different, knowing deep down tomorrow will be exactly the same. Now imagine a radically different scene. Imagine waking up 21 days later and feeling something you haven't felt in months, maybe years. Clarity. Not that superficial clarity that comes from a momentary burst of motivation, but deep clarity that comes from finally understanding what's been blocking you all this time. You look at that important task and instead of feeling paralysis, you feel genuine curiosity. What is my resistance trying to tell me today? You sit down to work, and when procrastination starts to emerge, you don't fight it with brute force. You don't try to ignore it or defeat it. You do something completely different. You talk to it. You ask which part of you is afraid and of what. And surprisingly, it answers. And in that answer is the key that unlocks everything. You work for 2 hours without interruption, not because you forced yourself, but because you resolved the internal conflict that was creating resistance. And when you finish, you're not exhausted. You're energized. Because for the first time you didn't use half your energy fighting yourself. And over 21 days doing this consistently, something profound shifts. Procrastination doesn't completely disappear, but it loses its absolute power over you. It transforms from prison into information, from enemy into messenger. The difference between these two versions of you isn't willpower. It isn't extreme discipline. It isn't a revolutionary productivity technique. It's shadow integration through deliberate practice. And today I'm going to give you 3 specific exercises based on Jungian psychology that, if you do honestly for 21 consecutive days, will fundamentally change your relationship with procrastination. Not because you'll become a productivity machine without emotions, but because you'll finally understand the language your shadow is speaking. And when you understand the language, you can negotiate instead of war. Especially when we get to the third exercise that Jung called active imagination, you'll discover a tool so powerful you'll wonder how you lived without it until now. Most people in 2025 still treat procrastination as a time management problem. They download apps. They create elaborate systems. They block distracting websites. They wake up earlier. And none of this works long term. Not because the techniques are bad, but because they're trying to solve the symptom while completely ignoring the cause. Carl Jung discovered over 100 years ago that persistent procrastination is never about lack of time or lack of method. It's always about unconscious conflict. It's always about one part of you wanting to grow while another part wants to stay safe. And until you resolve this internal conflict, no external system will work permanently. It's like trying to drive a car with the parking brake pulled. You can step harder on the gas. You can upgrade to a more powerful engine. But as long as that brake is engaged, you'll barely move. And the solution isn't more power. It's releasing the brake. The truth almost no one teaches you is this. Procrastination is your shadow's language. It's the way unconscious parts of you communicate fears you're not consciously paying attention to. And this communication isn't random. It follows specific, predictable patterns. For some people, procrastination emerges whenever there's risk of visibility because the shadow fears judgment. For others, it emerges whenever there's possibility of success because the shadow fears the responsibility success brings. For still others, it emerges whenever there's need for prolonged focus because the shadow associates focus with losing spontaneity or creativity. Each pattern reveals a specific fear. And when you identify which fear specifically is operating, you can address it directly instead of blindly fighting the resistance it creates. The 3 exercises I'm going to give you now are designed precisely for this. Identify the pattern, dialogue with the shadow creating it, and integrate the quality that dissolves the conflict. Exercise number 1. Shadow trigger mapping. Here's how it works. You'll need a physical notebook, not digital, because handwriting engages deeper parts of the brain that facilitate access to unconscious material. For 7 consecutive days, every time you feel procrastination arise when trying to work on something important, you'll pause everything. You won't try to push through the resistance. You won't judge yourself for feeling resistance. You'll simply stop and document. On the left page of your notebook, you write 3 things. First, what exactly were you about to do when procrastination emerged? Be specific. Don't write work on project. Write record first video for channel, or write report introduction, or make call to client. Second, what was the first emotion you felt when you thought about doing that task? Not the emotion you think you should feel. The emotion you actually felt. Maybe it was anxiety. Maybe it was boredom. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was anger. Be brutally honest. No one else will read this. Third, what was the first thought that passed through your head? Again, not the politically correct thought. The real thought. Maybe it was this will be horrible. Maybe it was I'll fail. Maybe it was this isn't worth it. Maybe it was people will judge me. Write exactly what your mind said. On the right page, you'll write 2 questions and leave space for answers that will emerge over the 7 days. First question. If this emotion could speak, what would it be trying to protect me from? Second question. What part of my personal history taught me this specific task is dangerous? And here's what's crucial. You won't try to answer these questions immediately. You'll leave them open. Because the truest answers rarely come from conscious analysis. They emerge from the unconscious over days as you continue observing patterns. And the pattern is what matters. Because after 7 days doing this, you'll have 7 entries. And when you review them all together, something remarkable will appear. You'll realize the same fears appear repeatedly in slightly different contexts. Maybe every time you need to promote yourself or be visible, fear of judgment emerges. Maybe every time you need to delegate or trust others, fear of losing control emerges. Maybe every time you need to complete something, fear emerges that your execution won't match your vision. These repetitive patterns are your shadow showing you exactly which unconscious belief is blocking your progress. And once you see the pattern clearly named in black and white, it loses 50% of its power immediately. Because you can't change what you can't see. But the moment you see, change becomes possible. Now here's where most people go wrong. They identify the pattern and then try to use logic to convince the shadow the fear is irrational. They try to argue, try to force, try to suppress. And this only strengthens resistance through the compensation effect Jung described. So instead, you'll do exercise number 2. Jungian validation dialogue. Here's the exact protocol. Every morning for the next 14 days, you'll wake up 15 minutes earlier. These 15 minutes are sacred. No phone. No distractions. Just you, your notebook, and the part of you that creates procrastination. You sit comfortably, close your eyes, and visualize the part of you that's afraid. Don't force a specific image. Let it appear however it wants. For some people it appears as a child. For others as a voice. For others as a physical sensation. However it appears, you recognize its presence. And then you initiate the most important dialogue of your integration journey. You begin with absolute validation. Not with judgment. Not with attempt to change. With pure validation. You say out loud or write, I see that you're afraid. And this fear makes sense. You're not trying to sabotage me. You're trying to protect me. And I'm grateful for that. You've been working so hard to keep me safe. And this validation isn't manipulation. It's truth. Your shadow really is trying to protect you. It genuinely believes procrastination is necessary for your psychological survival. So you validate that intention first. And then you ask, what exactly are you trying to protect me from now? And you wait. You don't force an answer. You create space for the answer to emerge. And often what emerges is surprisingly specific. Maybe the voice says, I'm protecting you from being humiliated like you were in that school presentation. Maybe it says, I'm protecting you from disappointing people if you fail like your father disappointed you. Maybe it says, I'm protecting you from losing your struggling person identity because if you succeed, who will you be? Whatever emerges, you write it down. You validate. You say, I understand why this scares you. Given what we've lived through, it makes total sense. And then comes the negotiation part. You don't try to convince the shadow the fear is unfounded. You offer a new possibility. You say, what if we could try doing this scary thing in a way that keeps you safe? What if we could grow without catastrophe? What if we could succeed and still be who we are? Are you willing to do an experiment with me? And then you propose a specific agreement. For example, if the shadow fears judgment when creating content, you say, how about for 21 days we create content but don't publish anything? We just practice. No risk of external judgment. Just safe practice. Can you let me do that? Or if the shadow fears failing when starting a business, you say, how about for 21 days we only do research and planning? Nothing that can fail yet. Just preparation. Does that feel safe enough? The key is creating a proposal the shadow can't reasonably reject because you've removed the specific element it fears. And when you do this consistently for 14 days, something profound happens. The shadow begins trusting you won't abandon or ignore it, that you're really taking its fears seriously. And this trust gradually relaxes the grip it has on your behavior. But integration isn't complete with just understanding and dialogue. It requires embodied action. And this is where exercise number 3 comes in. Minimum action with internal witness. This is based on Jung's concept of the transcendent function where consciousness and unconscious collaborate to create new behavior neither could generate alone. Here's how it works in practice. You identify the specific action your shadow most resists. Not 5 actions. 1. The scariest one. The one that generates most procrastination. And then you do something counterintuitive. You make it ridiculously small. So small your shadow can't justify blocking it. If the action is write a book and your shadow paralyzes you with fear of imperfection, the minimum action isn't write a chapter. It's write 1 sentence. Literally 1 sentence per day. If the action is record videos and your shadow freezes you with fear of judgment, the minimum action isn't record a complete video. It's record 10 seconds speaking to camera and then delete. If the action is networking and your shadow prevents you with fear of rejection, the minimum action isn't go to an event. It's send a 2-line message to 1 person. The action needs to be so small that executing it is easier than avoiding it. And here's the crucial part most minimum action techniques miss. You don't do this action trying to build momentum to do more. You do this action as a scientific experiment observed by a part of you Jung would call the internal witness. Before doing the action, you say internally to your shadow, we're going to do this small thing together. And I'm going to pay attention to how you feel during and after. And if you panic, we stop immediately. But if you survive, we've proven the fear was bigger than the real danger. Are you willing to try? And then you do the tiny action with total attention on your internal state. You're not trying to produce something good. You're collecting data about how your shadow responds. You write that terrible sentence. You record those awkward 10 seconds. You send that imperfect message. And then immediately after, you sit and document. How did my shadow react? Did the fear it predicted happen? Did I survive? And what you discover repeatedly over 21 days is the anticipated fear is always bigger than the real danger. Your shadow predicted catastrophe. But you wrote 1 bad sentence and the world didn't end. It predicted humiliation. But you recorded 10 clumsy seconds and nobody died. It predicted rejection. But you sent 1 message and even if the person didn't respond, you survived completely intact. And this accumulated evidence over 21 days is infinitely more powerful than any logical argument. Because you're not telling your shadow it's wrong. You're showing through repeated experience that growth is possible without catastrophe. That you can do scary things in small doses and not just survive but learn. And gradually, cell by cell, the unconscious belief changes. From growth is dangerous to growth is uncomfortable but manageable. And when this belief changes, procrastination loses its reason to exist. Because procrastination only makes sense if growth is genuinely dangerous. If growth is just uncomfortable, procrastination becomes an unnecessary cost you no longer need to pay. Now here's what many people ask. Why specifically 21 days? It's because 21 days is enough time to create familiarity without being so long you quit before seeing results. Neurologically, 21 days of consistent practice begins forming new neural patterns. Psychologically, 21 days is long enough to encounter and work through several iterations of the same fear. And spiritually, if you believe in lunar cycles, 21 days covers practically 3/4 of a cycle. Many traditions consider a period of significant transformation. But more important than the number is consistency. Doing these 3 exercises sporadically when you remember won't work. Procrastination is a deeply ingrained pattern reinforced maybe for decades of repetition. You don't dismantle this with occasional effort. You dismantle with deliberate daily practice even on days you don't want to. Especially on days you don't want to. Because these are exactly the days where your shadow is most active, trying to pull you back to the familiar pattern. And when you practice anyway, you're demonstrating to it that you're committed. That this isn't another temporary change attempt it can wait to pass. That this is a fundamental reorganization of how you operate. And this demonstration of commitment is what finally convinces the shadow to collaborate instead of resist. So here's the exact implementation protocol that maximizes success. Days 1 through 7. Exclusive focus on exercise 1, trigger mapping. You document each instance of procrastination without trying to change it. Just observe and record. This creates awareness without pressure. Days 8 through 14. You add exercise 2, validation dialogue, every morning. You still continue documenting triggers but now also actively dialogue with shadow. Days 15 through 21. You add exercise 3, minimum action with internal witness. Now you're doing all 3 simultaneously. Documenting patterns. Dialoguing with fears. Executing small actions. And in this 3rd week is when transformation accelerates dramatically because all 3 exercises reinforce each other. Jung emphasized integration isn't a one-time event. It's an ongoing process. So what happens after 21 days? You don't stop. But practice evolves. You no longer need to document every instance of procrastination because you've already identified the main patterns. You no longer need validation dialogue every morning because the communication channel with your shadow is established and you can access it when needed. But you continue minimum action. You continue taking small daily steps toward what scares you. Because consistent action is what keeps integration active. It's what prevents the shadow from recapturing territory you've liberated. And over months and years practicing this way, something extraordinary happens. Procrastination doesn't disappear. But it transforms. Instead of being a paralyzing force controlling you, it becomes an informative sensation you consult. When procrastination arises, you don't panic. You don't judge yourself. You get curious. You ask, what is my shadow trying to tell me now? What new fear has emerged I need to address? And you use the same 3 exercises to process this new fear. And each time you do this, you get faster. What used to paralyze you for weeks now pauses you for days. What used to paralyze you for days now pauses you for hours. And eventually you develop such fluency in your shadow's language that the complete conversation happens in minutes. You feel resistance. You identify fear. You validate. You negotiate. You act minimally. And you move forward. All this in a fraction of the time it used to take. There's an additional aspect of this Jung considered absolutely vital that many modern approaches completely ignore. He called it the numinosity of the shadow. It's the sacred or deeply significant quality the shadow carries. Because remember, your shadow doesn't contain only fears and traumas. It also contains exiled qualities you rejected for believing them unacceptable. And often the most numinous qualities, the most powerful ones, are locked there. So as you do these 3 exercises over 21 days, pay special attention not just to fears that emerge but also to qualities you discover were hidden behind fears. Maybe you discover behind fear of being visible exists a deep and beautiful desire to contribute you had suppressed. Maybe behind fear of failure exists healthy ambition you judged as arrogance. Maybe behind fear of success exists genuine personal power you incorrectly associated with abuse. These numinous qualities are treasures. They're exactly what you need to realize your potential. And when you free them from shadow's prison and bring them to conscious expression, they don't just eliminate procrastination. They catapult you forward with a force you didn't know you possessed. So let me give you a concrete example of how this unfolds in real life. Imagine someone who procrastinates writing. They've wanted to write a book for years but never start. In week 1 of trigger mapping, they discover every time they think about writing, fear emerges that their ideas are banal. In week 2 of validation dialogue, they discover this fear comes from a teacher in school who publicly ridiculed an essay they wrote at 12 years old. The shadow is trying to protect them from reliving that humiliation. So they validate. They say to the 12-year-old part inside them, "It makes total sense you're afraid. That was horrible. I don't blame you for not wanting to go through that again." And then they negotiate. They say, "What if we write just for ourselves for now? No one else will read. No risk of judgment." The shadow agrees with this proposal. In week 3 they begin minimum action. 1 sentence per day. And they discover something surprising. Writing that sentence isn't painful. Actually, it's pleasurable. And as they continue, they realize behind fear of banality was a genuine creative voice that had been silenced for decades. And this voice isn't banal. It's unique. It's powerful. It's exactly what the world needs to hear. And by the end of 21 days, they haven't written a complete book. But they've written 21 sentences that became 21 paragraphs that became the beginning of something significant. And more importantly, they broke the association between writing and pain. They proved to the shadow creative growth is possible without emotional catastrophe. And this proof opens the floodgates. In following months, they write more than they wrote in their entire life. Not because they forced, but because they removed the internal obstacle blocking natural flow. And that's the real promise of these 3 exercises. Not that you'll become robotically productive, but that you'll remove the psychological blocks preventing your natural expression. Because humans are naturally creative, naturally productive, naturally growth-oriented when there's no fear blocking the path. Procrastination isn't your natural state. It's a defense against perceived danger. And when you resolve the danger at the root through shadow integration, the defense becomes unnecessary. And flow returns. Not perfectly. Not without effort. But without the massive internal resistance that used to consume 80% of your energy. If you apply these 3 exercises exactly as I described for 21 consecutive days, procrastination won't magically disappear on the 22nd day. But you'll have built a communication channel with your shadow that didn't exist before. You'll have collected experiential evidence that growth is possible without catastrophe. And you'll have begun liberating exiled qualities that have been imprisoned waiting for you to have courage to look at them. And these 3 things together change everything. Not overnight, but consistently, irreversibly, profoundly. So I want to leave you with a final question. If you knew your procrastination is trying to protect you from something, and you could discover from what in just 7 days of honest documentation, would you be willing to try? If you made it to this point in the video, it means something in this Jungian approach resonated deeply. So subscribe to the Shadow Dialogue. Leave a comment telling me which of the 3 exercises you'll start today. Remember, I'm not a therapist. This content is for educational purposes. Any real transformation depends on your commitment to honest and consistent practice during the complete 21 days.